The ritual was always the same. Crush the bitter root, whisper the binding words, and pray the beast inside me stayed silent. In the halls of the Silver Moon Kingdom, a servant's only shield is to have no scent at all, especially not one the king might recognize. Chapter 1. The Scent of Silence. Everything has always been the same without changes. Crush the bitter wolfsbane root into a paste. Its sharp, earthy smell a familiar poison. Whisper the binding words my mother had bled for, a desperate prayer against my own blood. Pray the beast inside me, the magnificent, howling, silver-pelted truth of me, stayed silent for just one more day. I smeared the concoction over my pulse points, the sting a constant reminder of the lie I wore as my skin. In the cold stone halls of the Silver Moon Kingdom, a servant's only shield is to have no scent at all, especially not one the king might recognize. Moving through the castle was like walking on a frozen lake, every step a risk of falling into the icy depths. I carried trays of polished silver and steaming food, my eyes always downcast, my presence as thin as a whisper. The other servants, with their human smells of sweat and soap and simple fear, chattered around me. They were background noise. I was nothing. A ghost in a gray uniform, my face plain, my existence forgettable. It was a masterpiece of self-destruction painted over 10 agonizing years. They feared the king. Of course they did. King Charles wasn't just a ruler. He was a force of nature, a storm trapped in the shape of a man. When he walked into a room, the air grew heavy, thick with unspoken violence. Laughter died in throats. People shrank back, not from anything he did, but from what he was. A predator, an alpha of alphas whose own wolf was said to be a feral, uncontrollable thing. The whispers said he was cursed, that the moon goddess had denied him his fated mate, and the absence had hollowed him out, leaving only the beast behind. I saw him then. He was standing by a great arched window, staring out at the falling snow, his back to the bustling throne room. Even from across the hall, I could feel the coiled tension in his massive frame, the restless energy that seemed to bleed from him and stain the very air. He was magnificent, and he was terrifying. My sworn enemy. The son of the man who signed my mother's death warrant. The reason I was this empty shell. And my heart gave a painful, treacherous thud. His head turned. Slowly. Not towards the sounds of the court, but in my direction. As if he'd heard that single, traitorous heartbeat from across 100 feet of marble and noise. His eyes, they were the color of gold in a dying fire, and they swept the room with a hungry, desperate intensity. Searching. Always searching. They passed over me, through me, seeing nothing more than a servant girl holding a platter. He saw the lie, and the lie held. But for a heartbeat, a terrifying, soul-shattering instant, I felt seen. I fled. My feet were silent on the stone as I retreated to the kitchens, the platter rattling in my trembling hands. I pressed my back against the cool, damp wall, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The encounter had lasted only a moment, but it had cracked the placid surface of my control. Something was changing. The ice beneath my feet was beginning to thin, and I could feel the cold, dark water of destiny swirling just beneath. He was getting closer. Or maybe the beast inside me was finally starting to call back. Chapter 2 Echoes in the Stone. Later, when the moon was high and the castle was draped in slumber, the ghost slipped from her tiny room. The real me, the one I kept locked away in the daylight, came out to breathe. I moved through the sleeping castle, a shadow among shadows, my bare feet making no sound on the cold floors. My destination was a forgotten balcony, high in a crumbling, unused spire. It was the only place I felt safe, the only place I could almost be free. The wind was a wild thing up here, whipping my plain dress around my legs and tearing at my hair. It smelled of pine and coming snow. It smelled of freedom. Here, I let the lie peel back just a little. I closed my eyes and reached for the wolf. It was a pained, weakened thing after a decade of poison and prayers, but it was still there. a flicker of silver fire deep in my soul. I let it stretch, just for a moment, feeling the phantom ache of powerful muscles and the ghost of a snout on my face. My mother's voice came to me on the wind, a memory so sharp it was like a fresh cut. Your power is not a curse, Alyssa. It is a gift. Never let them make you forget what you are. The memory was from our last night together. She was braiding my hair, her hands strong and sure, even as the guards waited outside our door. She didn't show any fear. She only showed me love. Was I honoring her by hiding? Or was I letting them win all over again every single day? The question was a constant, dull ache in my chest, a soft scrape of leather on stone behind me. I froze. Every muscle in my body went rigid. I hadn't heard anyone approach. Impossible. It is late to be admiring the view, little mouse. The voice was smooth as velvet, but it coiled around me like a snake. I turned slowly, my heart a frantic drum against my ribs. It was Kyle, Lord Kyle, the king's beta and most trusted friend. He stood there, leaning against the doorframe, a faint knowing smile on his handsome face. He was everything Charles was not, charming where the king was brutal, smiling where the king scowled. Yet, I had always felt a different kind of danger from him, a cold, calculating intelligence in his pale blue eyes. "My lord," I murmured, dipping into a curtsy, my head bowed to hide my face. My mind raced. How did he find me? Why was he here? I couldn't sleep. "A common affliction in this castle," he said, his tone conversational, but his eyes were sharp, missing nothing. So much restless energy, especially around the king. He took a step closer. "You are new to the king's personal service, are you not?" "I have served in the palace for 10 years, my lord," I said, my voice carefully neutral. "Ah, but you have only recently been assigned duties that bring you near him." His smile widened, but it didn't reach his eyes. "He seems agitated by your presence. One must be careful. The king is not a tame creature. It would be a tragedy if such a quiet, diligent servant were to upset him." The threat was there, wrapped in a silken ribbon of concern. It wasn't a warning to protect me. It was a warning to tell me I was being watched. He knew something. Maybe not what I was, but he saw something in the king's reaction to me, and it had made him curious. A beta's curiosity could be just as deadly as an alpha's rage. "Thank you, my lord. I will be more careful," I whispered. He just nodded, that chilling smile still in place, and then he was gone, melting back into the shadows as silently as he'd appeared. I stayed on that balcony for a long time, the wind no longer feeling like freedom, but like a lonely, mournful cry. I wasn't just hiding from the king anymore. There was a second set of eyes on me now, and I had the terrifying feeling they were far more perceptive. Chapter 3. The Beast at the Banquet. The Great Hall was a masterpiece of noise and light, a chaotic symphony of clattering plates, booming laughter, and the rich, decadent smells of roasted boar and spiced wine. To everyone else, it was a celebration. To me, it was a battlefield. Every scent was an assault, a reminder of the vibrant, living world I had cut myself off from. I moved through the throngs of laughing nobles, a gray ghost with a silver tray, my face a perfect mask of obedient emptiness. Across the room, on his dark wood throne, sat the king. He was a study in stillness, a brooding storm cloud in the midst of the party's bright cheer. He hadn't touched his food. He hadn't tasted his wine. His golden eyes restlessly scanned the crowd, again and again, like a wolf searching for a threat, or for something it had lost. His gaze swept past me twice, and both times, the wolf inside my soul whimpered, a low, mournful sound that was thankfully silenced by my poisoned blood. Each pass of his eyes felt like a physical touch, a spark of heat on my cold skin. "You look frightened, little mouse." I turned to find Lord Kale beside me, a goblet of wine in his hand. He had appeared out of nowhere, his movements as silent as a cat's. His smile was charming, but his eyes were like chips of ice. The hall is crowded, my lord, I offered, a pathetic excuse. Is it the crowd you fear? He murmured, taking a deliberate step closer, forcing me to tilt my head back to look at him. His voice dropped to a conspiratorial whisper. Or the beast that presides over it? Such a tragedy, is it not? A king so broken. They say a mateless alpha is an affront to the goddess herself. My blood ran cold. He was testing me. His words were casual, but they were aimed with surgical precision. He was fishing, trying to see what secrets I might hold. I kept my expression blank, my body language submissive. I do not listen to gossip, my lord. His lips quirked. A wise policy. He held my gaze for a long moment before turning away. Just as he did, I had to pass by the dais to serve another table. This time, I was closer to the throne than I had ever been. Close enough to smell the faint, clean scent of winter and ozone that clung to the king. Close enough to see the hard line of his jaw, the raw power thrumming just beneath his skin. And then it happened. As I drew level with his chair, a growl ripped through the air. It wasn't loud. It was a low, deep, guttural rumble that vibrated through the stone floor and up my bones. It was the most terrifying and beautiful sound I had ever heard. The chatter in the hall faltered. All eyes snapped to the king. Charles was on his feet, his chair scraping violently against the floor. His hands were clenched into fists at his sides, his knuckles white. His golden eyes were blazing, not at me, but at Lord Cale, who stood just a few feet away. A low snarl tore from the king's lips. Mine! The word was a primal claim, a shockwave of possession that had nothing to do with conscious thought. It was pure, feral instinct. Cale's charming smile vanished, replaced by a flicker of genuine shock, and was that fear? The entire hall held its breath, waiting for the explosion. But I couldn't breathe at all. I fled. I dropped my tray with a clatter and ran, pushing through the stunned crowd, my only thought to escape. I didn't stop until I was in the cold, empty corridors, my back pressed against the stone, my body shaking uncontrollably. That growl, that word, it hadn't been aimed at Cale. Not really. I knew it in my soul. It had shot past the beta and sunk into me like a hook. It was a call that had been searching for a decade, and deep inside me, in the cage of herbs and willpower where I had imprisoned my wolf, something stirred. Something powerful. It pushed against its bonds, not with a whimper, but with an answering roar of its own. Chapter 4. The Storm and the Scent. The storm broke over the castle with the fury of a dying god. It wasn't just rain. It was a violent assault, a battering ram of wind and water against the stone walls. Thunder cracked the sky open, the sound so deep it vibrated in my bones, a primal drumbeat calling to the beast I kept chained in my soul. Every flash of lightning was a stark, blue-white reminder of how fragile my world was, how quickly the darkness could be ripped away. The castle, usually a fortress of grim silence, felt alive with the storm's rage, as if it were trying to tear itself apart. And in the midst of that chaos, I was summoned. A guard, his face pale and his cloak dripping water onto the polished floors, found me in the kitchens. "The king requires you," he said, his voice tight. "His private study. Now." Panic, cold and sharp, stabbed through me. Why? Why me? And why his study? A sanctum no servant ever entered unless the castle was on fire? My mind raced, but there was no time for questions. To refuse a direct order from the king was to sign your own death warrant. So I ran. I ran through the courtyards, the wind tearing at me, the rain plastering my thin servant's dress to my skin in seconds. It was a brutal, cleansing deluge. The water washed away the dirt of the day, and with it, the bitter, protective paste of the wolfsbane. My shield, my lie. My entire world dissolved in the downpour. I burst into his study without knocking, a drowned rat spilling rainwater onto a priceless rug. My lungs burned. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. The room was dark, lit only by a dying fire and the furious, strobing light of the storm outside. He was standing there, a massive silhouette against the window, watching the chaos. He didn't turn. Not at first. The silence stretched, thick and heavy, broken only by my ragged breathing and the roar of the thunder. Then, he inhaled. It was a slow, deep breath. A predator tasting the air. I saw his shoulders stiffen. I saw his head tilt, just a fraction. A flash of lightning bleached the room white. In that stark, terrifying light, he turned his head and his eyes, his golden, blazing eyes, found mine across the dark room. And I knew he could finally smell me. The air crackled, the world seemed to slow down. The scent I had hidden for a decade, the scent of moonlight and wild things, of winter storms and silver fir, was naked in the air between us. It was the scent of his other half, his missing soul, his mate. I saw the shock on his face, the dawning, feral disbelief. I saw his eyes flare, the gold burning so brightly it chased the shadows from his face, revealing the beast that lived just beneath the skin. "You," he whispered, the word not a question, but a condemnation, a revelation, a curse. My survival instinct screamed, "Run!" But I was frozen, pinned by his gaze, by the sheer, overwhelming force of his will. The room felt like it was shrinking, the walls closing in, all the air being sucked towards him. He moved, not with the grace of a king, but with the explosive speed of a striking wolf. 1 second he was by the window, the next he was in front of me, his heat and his power a crushing physical weight. His hands slammed against the wall on either side of my head, caging me in. His face was inches from mine, his eyes wild, his breath coming in a harsh pant. He snarled, a low, guttural sound of pure, undiluted rage and desperate, agonizing want. Chapter 5. A Traitor's Blood. The world was nothing but the scent of him, ozone and winter and a rage so profound it felt like it could burn my skin. His body was a wall of heat and muscle, pinning me against the cold, damp stone of the corridor. He had dragged me from his study, his grip on my arm a brand of iron, his silence more terrifying than any shout. Now, in the flickering torchlight of a deserted hallway, the king's control finally shattered, and the beast looked out through his eyes. "Who are you?" he snarled, each word a stone dropped into a deep, dark well. My voice was gone, stolen by a decade of silence and a moment of pure terror. I could only shake my head, a pathetic, useless gesture. "Don't lie to me," he roared, his voice bouncing off the walls, a physical blow. "I have felt you, a whisper, a ghost in my own home for years. I thought I was going mad. But it was you, hiding." He leaned closer, his golden eyes searching my face, stripping away every defense I had. "How did you hide your scent from me? What are you?" I found a sliver of my will, a shard of the defiance I had honed in the dark. "I am a servant," I choked out. A humorless, dangerous laugh escaped him. "A servant?" he growled, his gaze dropping to my throat, where my pulse hammered wildly. "My wolf has been howling your name since the day I took the throne. It has starved for you. It has torn me apart from the inside out looking for you. And you were scrubbing my floors?" The injustice of it, the sheer raw agony in his voice, broke something in me. The fear remained, but a cold, hard anger rose to meet it. He was in pain? What did he know of pain? "My name," I said, my voice suddenly clear and cold, "is Alyssa, daughter of Lyra." I watched the name land. I saw the recognition dawn, followed by a wave of disbelief so potent it made him recoil just for a second. The name of my mother was poison in this castle. She was the great traitor, the alpha female who was executed for conspiring to kill his father, the old king. "No," he breathed, his rage momentarily replaced by something that looked like horror. "It cannot be." "She was innocent," I whispered, the words tasting like ash. A memory, sharp and brutal, flashed behind my eyes, my mother's calm face, a smear of dirt on her cheek as she was led away in chains. Her last look was not one of fear but of love, a look that had fueled me for 10 long years. "She was a traitor. Her blood is tainted," he roared, slamming his fist into the wall beside my head. The stone cracked. Dust rained down. "Do you have any idea what the prophecies say? Do you know what your bloodline means when joined with mine? It is salvation, or it is absolute ruin. And you have been hiding under my nose, a viper in my own den." The prophecy. I had heard whispers, fragments of it my mother had told me, but the court had buried the knowledge along with her body. It was a secret too dangerous to exist. "I did it to survive," I said, my voice trembling but unbroken. "You killed my family, you hunted everyone with my name. What choice did I have?" The truth of my words hit him. The war inside him was plain on his face. The king saw the daughter of his enemy, a threat to his entire kingdom, a living embodiment of a catastrophic prophecy. But his wolf saw only its mate, its other half, found at last after a decade of torment. The rage in his eyes softened, just for a moment, into an expression of pure, desperate agony. He looked like a man being torn in two. He shoved himself away from me, stumbling back a step, and turned his back, his massive shoulders heaving. He was a caged animal, trapped by his duty, his blood, and the one thing in the universe he was born to protect and desire. "Get up," he commanded, his voice a low, ragged rasp. He didn't look at me as he started walking, stalking down the corridor towards the royal wing, towards his chambers. I had no choice but to follow in the wake of his storm, my legs shaking, my mind numb. The law demanded my death. His wolf demanded my life. And I was trapped, utterly and completely, in the brutal space between. Chapter 6. The gilded cage dawn came. Not with light, but with a slow gray draining of the darkness. I woke on a plush crimson rug, the unfamiliar softness beneath me a cruel joke. My body ached with a deep, soul-level exhaustion. For a moment, I didn't know where I was. Then the scent hit me, that same intoxicating, terrifying smell of winter and power, and my eyes snapped open. I was in his chambers, the king's chambers, a vast room of dark wood, rich tapestries, and a massive bed that I had clearly been left to sleep on the floor in front of. A prisoner. The gilded cage was real. The heavy oak door opened, and he walked in. He had changed into fresh clothes, his face a cold, unreadable mask. The feral, desperate beast from last night was gone, replaced by the iron-willed king. But the beast wasn't gone. I could feel it. Since he'd scented me, a new, strange sense had awakened in me. I could feel the thrum of his power, the restless energy of his wolf pacing just beneath his skin. He stopped in the center of the room, his golden eyes pinning me to the floor. "You are not a prisoner," he said, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. It was somehow more frightening than his rage. I slowly got to my feet, my plain servant's dress rumpled and still faintly damp. "Then I am free to leave?" The question was a risk, a test. A cold, dangerous smile touched his lips. "No." He let the word hang in the air. "You are not a prisoner. You are my servant. You will continue your duties, but you will perform them here. Only here. You will serve me, and only me. You will not leave these rooms without my permission. Do you understand?" The cruelty of it stole my breath. This wasn't a prison of stone and iron, but one of forced proximity. A torment designed for us both. He would keep his enemy close, and his wolf would have its mate within reach, a constant, agonizing temptation. My jaw tightened. And what if I refuse? He took a slow step towards me. "Then I will have you chained to that wall. You will still be in this room. You will still be near me. The only difference will be your comfort." He stopped, towering over me. "I would prefer you comfortable." There was no choice. Not really. Later, the test came. He sat at a large table, papers spread before him, ignoring me completely. But his focus wasn't on his work. I could feel it. Every ounce of his attention was on me as I stood silently by the wall. "Water," he said, not looking up. My body moved on instinct, on 10 years of training. I went to a silver pitcher, poured a glass, and brought it to him. My hands were steady. My face was a blank mask. I would not let him see how this terrified me. I placed the glass on the table beside his hand. As I pulled back, his fingers brushed against mine. Fire. A jolt, sharp and electric, shot up my arm. The world tilted for a second. My heart stuttered, and in that moment of contact, I felt it. A phantom echo in my own chest. The heavy, controlled beat of his heart. And with it, a flash of his emotion. A deep, aching loneliness so profound it almost brought me to my knees. The mate bond. It was real. A live wire connecting us, whether we wanted it to be or not. I snatched my hand back as if I'd been burned, a small gasp escaping my lips. His head snapped up, his golden eyes blazing, and I knew he had felt it too. I saw a flicker of shock, of vulnerability in his expression before the cold mask slammed back down. He thought he had me trapped. He thought he was in control. But in that moment, I knew he was just as much a prisoner of this bond as I was. A surge of defiance, cold and pure, rose through my fear. "I will serve you because I must," I said, my voice quiet but shaking with intensity. "But I will not be your pet, and I will not be your dirty little secret." His eyes narrowed. The power in the room swelled, pressing down on me, a physical weight that made it hard to breathe. He didn't move. He didn't speak for a long time. Then, his voice came, low and deadly. "You will do as I command," he whispered, the words a promise of pain. "Or I will remind you, and my entire court, what we do to the daughters of traitors." Chapter 7. A War of Whispers days bled into a silent, suffocating routine. I was a ghost haunting the king's chambers, a shadow that served his meals, made his bed, and endured the crushing weight of his unspoken presence. He worked at his great oak desk, the scratch of his quill the only sound for hours on end. He never spoke to me. He rarely even looked. But I felt his awareness as a constant, prickling heat on my skin. He was a storm held in check, and I was the lightning rod he refused to touch. This cage of silence was a battlefield, and I learned to fight with weapons he couldn't see. I started with small rebellions. I would organize the books on his shelves not by title, but by the color of their spines, a subtle chaos only I would know. When I served his wine, my hand would linger on the decanter for a heartbeat too long, a silent challenge. Sometimes, when he was lost in thought, staring into the fire, I would just watch him. I would trace the hard lines of his face, the exhaustion that carved faint lines around his golden eyes, the raw power in the slope of his shoulders. I was supposed to be invisible, but in these stolen moments, I felt like the one with all the power, the unseen observer of the beast in its lair. One afternoon, as I reached to place a stack of scrolls on a high shelf, the step stool wobbled. I lost my balance, a small cry escaping my lips as I tipped backward, expecting the hard shock of the floorboards. But the impact never came. Instead, strong arms wrapped around me, breaking my fall. I was flush against him, my back pressed into the solid wall of his chest. His heart hammered against my spine, a frantic, powerful rhythm that echoed the wild beating of my own. His scent enveloped me, clean winter and that dangerous ozone, and my head swam. His hands were firm on my waist, branding me through the thin fabric of my dress. And then it happened. The contact was a key turning a lock. A jolt, more powerful than any before, shot through me. It wasn't just a feeling. It was a vision. A flash of memory that wasn't mine. A younger Charles, barely a man, standing over the body of his father, the old king. The weight of a crown settling on his brow, not with glory, but with the crushing finality of a tombstone, a wave of grief, of suffocating duty, of a loneliness so profound it was a physical ache. I gasped, stumbling out of his grasp as if I'd been burned, my eyes wide with shock. It was too much, too intimate. I had seen a piece of his soul. He stared back at me, his own face a mask of stunned disbelief. The cold king was gone, and in his place was the boy from the vision, his eyes filled with a raw, unguarded pain. He had felt the connection, too. He knew I had seen something. The air between us was thick with it, a shared secret that had just been torn open. The silence that followed was different. It was no longer empty. It was heavy with the weight of what had just passed between us. He turned away first, his movements stiff, and walked to the window, staring out with his back to me. "Every breath you take in this room," he said, his voice a low, rough rasp that barely carried across the space, "is a test." It wasn't a threat. It was a confession, a raw admission of his own struggle. And I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that this gilded cage was not just my prison. It was ours. Chapter 8. The Mark of the Beast. For the first time in weeks, the routine shattered. A royal council meeting was called, an urgent matter that required the king's presence. I expected to be locked in his chambers, left to the suffocating silence. Instead, he stopped at the door, his golden eyes pinning me with an unreadable expression. "You will come," he commanded. He didn't explain why. He simply led me through the halls, his royal guards trailing behind us like grim shadows. He left me in the antechamber outside the council room, a grand, cold space with tapestries depicting ancient werewolf battles. "Wait here," was his only instruction before he swept inside, the heavy doors booming shut behind him. I stood there feeling exposed and confused. Why bring me? Was this another test? A way to keep me under his eye, even when he was busy? A smooth voice cut through my thoughts. "Does he keep you on a short leash, little mouse?" Lord Kale emerged from a nearby alcove, his expression a perfect blend of charming concern and subtle mockery. My entire body went rigid. I had avoided him for weeks, but it seemed my luck had run out. "My lord," I murmured, dipping my head. "A king should not be so easily distracted," he continued, ignoring my formality as he closed the distance between us. His pale blue eyes roamed over me, a little too familiar, a little too assessing. "He is a storm, and you are the strange calm at its center. It has made many people curious." He reached out, his fingers cool as they brushed a stray strand of hair from my cheek. "They wonder what hold a simple servant girl could have over the Beast King." I flinched back from his touch, my skin crawling. "I have no hold over him." "No?" Kyle's smile was sharp. "I think you do. And I think you have no idea the power you wield." His hand dropped to my arm, his grip surprisingly strong. "Or the danger you are in." At that exact moment, the council room doors burst open. Charles stood there, his face a thundercloud. His gaze fell upon us, upon Kale's hand on my arm, and the air in the antechamber turned to ice. It wasn't a gradual change. It was a sudden, violent drop in temperature, a physical manifestation of his rage. The lords and ladies filing out of the meeting froze, their conversations dying in their throats. The king's eyes, they were no longer human. They were pure, molten gold. A low, guttural sound, more animal than man, ripped from his chest. It was the sound of a predator staking its claim. Before Kale could even react, Charles crossed the space in 2 long, silent strides. He didn't shout. He didn't speak. He simply grabbed Kale by the throat and slammed him against the opposite wall. The impact was sickening, a crack of bone against stone that echoed in the dead silence. Guards drew their swords, their faces a mixture of terror and confusion. Kyle gasped, his face turning purple, his feet dangling above the floor. Charles leaned in, his snarl a breath of hot air against Kale's face. He was completely gone. The king was gone. Only the feral, possessive beast remained, ready to tear apart anyone who dared touch what belonged to him. The entire court was frozen, watching their king lose control. In that moment of horrified silence, an instinct I didn't know I possessed took over. "Charles!" My voice cut through the tension like a blade. It was sharp, clear, and imbued with a strange authority I had never felt before. For a single, crucial second, his blazing golden eyes flickered to me. The rage in them was still there, but beneath it, I saw a flicker of confusion, a flicker of him. It was enough. The spell was broken. His grip loosened, and Kyle dropped to the floor, choking and gasping for air. Charles didn't look at his beaten beta. He didn't look at the terrified court. His burning gaze was locked on me. Without another word, he grabbed my arm, his grip bruising but not intentionally cruel, and stalked away, dragging me behind him. The last thing I saw was the look on Cale's face as he watched us go. Not of fear, but of cold, calculating triumph. He had gotten exactly what he wanted. He had proven to the entire world that the king was compromised. Chapter 9. The Price of Ruin. The chambers were a blur of destruction. He didn't speak to me, didn't even look at me as he dragged me inside and slammed the door. Then, the storm broke. A priceless vase shattered against a wall. A stack of books was swept from a table, their pages fluttering to the floor like wounded birds. He paced the room like a caged lion, a caged beast, his power rolling off him in suffocating waves, his breath coming in harsh, ragged snarls. I stood by the door, trembling, my arm throbbing where he'd grabbed me. I had seen his beast before, but this was different. This was a loss of control so complete it terrified me to my very soul. And I was the cause. Cale had lit the match, but I was the kindling. I was the fuse. The prophecy his words had hinted at echoed in my mind. Salvation, or absolute ruin. Looking at him now, a king consumed by a feral rage, a ruler who had just exposed his great weakness to his entire court, I saw the path ahead with horrifying clarity. It was a path of destruction. My presence here would unravel him, would shatter his kingdom. I was not his salvation. I was his doom. A curse wrapped in the skin of a mate. The very thing my mother had died to protect our bloodline from becoming. My fear, cold and sharp, solidified into a desperate, painful resolve. There was only one way to stop this. One way to save him from me. "Stop," I whispered. He froze, his back to me, his shoulders heaving. I took a shaky breath, gathering every ounce of strength I had left. "I will not be the weakness that brings you down," I said, my voice growing stronger, clearer, fueled by a terrible, self-sacrificing certainty. "I will not be the curse that your enemies use to destroy you. I will not be the reason your kingdom falls to ruin." He turned slowly, his face a mask of confusion and pain. The golden blaze in his eyes banked to a low, dangerous glow. "What are you saying?" I met his gaze, my own eyes burning with unshed tears. I lifted my chin, and with a voice that did not tremble, I spoke the most profound lie of my life. I spoke the words that would save him and destroy me. I, Alyssa of the Silver Moon bloodline, reject you, Charles, as my mate. The silence that followed was absolute. It was the silence of a world holding its breath, the silence before the sky falls. Then came the pain. It wasn't a thought or an emotion. It was a physical, searing agony that ripped through my body from the inside out. It felt like my soul was being torn in half. A scream was torn from my throat as my knees buckled and I collapsed to the floor, clutching my chest. The world went white with a pain so pure, so absolute. It was all that existed. Through the haze of my own agony, I heard him. It wasn't a roar of rage. It was a scream, a raw, broken sound of a creature being flayed alive. I looked up, my vision swimming, and saw him stagger back, clutching his own chest, his face contorted in a mask of unbearable suffering. The bond was fighting back. It was real. It was alive, and it refused to be broken. It was punishing us both with the full, horrifying price of my words. We were both on the floor then, shattered, gasping for breath in the wreckage of his room. The rage was gone, burned away by a pain that transcended everything else. There was only a raw, shared vulnerability. He crawled towards me, his movements clumsy, his face pale. He reached me, his eyes filled with a pain that was a perfect mirror of my own. "You cannot," he choked out, his voice a raw, broken whisper as his hand hovered just above my cheek, afraid to touch me. And I cannot. His words were the final, undeniable truth. We were trapped, bound together by a force more powerful than will, more absolute than law. The path to ruin was the only one we were allowed to walk. "We are," he breathed, his gaze locked on mine, sealing our terrible fate. Broken. Chapter 10. The Truce in the Ruins. We were two survivors in the wreckage of a war that had lasted only a few minutes. The silence in the room was a fragile thing, stretched thin over the echoes of our shared pain. My body still felt hollowed out, the agony of the rejection having scoured me clean, leaving behind a raw, trembling vulnerability. He was across the room, slumped in a chair, his head in his hands. The fearsome king, the raging beast, was gone. In his place was just a man, broken and breathing in the ruins of his own self-control. The anger was gone. The fear was still there, a cold stone in my gut. But it was different now. It was no longer the fear of a predator, but the fear of a shared, inescapable fate. We had tried to break the chain, and it had nearly broken us instead. I was the first to speak, my voice a raw whisper in the quiet. "We cannot be undone." He looked up, his golden eyes dull with exhaustion and a pain that mirrored my own. "No," he agreed, the word rough, torn from his throat. "It seems the goddess is crueler than the storytellers claim." He dragged a hand down his face. "I never fully believed the official story. The admission shocked me into stillness." "What?" "About your mother," he clarified, his gaze distant, lost in a past I could only imagine. "I was young when it happened, but I knew her. She was proud, fierce. She was the very soul of the Silver Moon Pack. A traitor? It never fit. But the evidence was absolute, and my father—" He trailed off, a muscle working in his jaw. My father was not a strong king. He was led by his council, by his friends. It was the first crack in the wall of his certainty. The first time he had ever spoken of my mother as anything but a criminal. A tiny, fragile seed of hope began to sprout in the wasteland of my despair. If he could doubt if the all-powerful king could question the very foundation of his reign, then maybe there was a truth worth finding. "If we are trapped on this path together," I said, my voice gaining a sliver of strength as I pushed myself to my feet, "then I will know the truth of why it was laid. I will not walk to my ruin for a lie." He watched me, his expression unreadable. For a long moment, he said nothing. He simply studied me, his gaze so intense it felt like he was seeing past my skin, past my bones, into the very heart of the wolf I kept hidden. He saw the strength I had nurtured in secret. He saw the daughter of Lyra, finally demanding justice. "What do you propose?" he asked, his voice low. "The trial records," I said, the plan forming even as I spoke. "The evidence, the testimonies, everything. You are the king. You can unseal them. Let me see them. Let us see them." He was silent for a long time, the only sound the crackle of the fire. I could feel the weight of his decision. To do this would be to question his father's justice, to risk uncovering a rot that went to the very heart of his kingdom. It was treason in its own way. Finally, he rose from his chair. He was no longer the broken man, but the king again, his presence filling the room. But something had changed. The space between us was no longer a chasm of hatred and fear. It was something else. a shared ground of desperation. "We are not allies, Alyssa," he said, his voice a low, hard rumble. "We are two people tied to the same sinking stone." He walked towards me, stopping just before me, his shadow falling over me. "But I will not drown without knowing who pushed us." That night, under the sliver of a new moon, he led me to the Royal Archives. The air was thick with the smell of dust and old parchment. He broke the wax seal on a heavy, leather-bound folio, the sound like a gunshot in the silence. He pushed it towards me. On the cover, in faded gold leaf, was my family's name. My hands trembled as I opened it to the first page and read the first lie, a signed testimony against my mother, a damning account of a meeting that never happened. Chapter 11. The Name in the Margins. The archives became our new cage, our new battlefield. Every night after the castle slept, we would descend into the dusty silence, the candlelight throwing our shadows long and distorted against the towering shelves. The world shrank to the space between us, to the rustle of dry parchment and the low murmur of our voices. We were no longer king and servant, but co-conspirators, bound by a shared, desperate need for the truth. We worked through a mountain of lies, guard rotation schedules that had been mysteriously altered, transcripts of testimony from pack members who had been loyal to my mother their entire lives, suddenly turning on her with venomous, hollow words. I saw the names of people I had once called family, their signatures condemning the woman who had led them. "They were threatened," I whispered one night, my finger tracing a name. "Lord Valerius. He loved my mother like a sister. He would never have said these things." Charles nodded, his eyes grim. "His lands were seized for failure to pay taxes a week after the trial," he said, his knowledge of the kingdom's history a sharp, brutal tool. His entire family was sent to the northern outposts, a death sentence in all but name. It was a pattern. Every witness who spoke against her was either rewarded with land and titles, or their families were ruined, their lives forfeit. It wasn't a trial. It was a purge. He provided the cold political context, the web of power and greed that underpinned everything. I provided the heart, the knowledge of the people involved, the personal betrayals that cut deeper than any political maneuvering. We were two halves of a key, and together we were beginning to turn the lock. But the final piece, the one that broke everything open, was not in a testimony. It was in a dry, boring ledger detailing the transfer of assets from attainted families. My family's lands, our silver mines, our ancestral home, all of it had been seized by the crown, but it hadn't stayed with the crown. Weeks later, it had been transferred for a pittance to a newly formed holding company, a company with no name, only a series of numbers and a complex legal charter. I stared at it, confused. "What is this?" Charles was silent. I looked up and saw his face had gone pale, his expression frozen in a mask of dawning horror. He took the ledger from my hands, his fingers tracing the intricate legal phrasing, the web of shell corporations and hidden ownership. "This charter," he breathed, his voice barely a whisper. "The structure, the loopholes. There is only one man in this kingdom who weaves corporate law like this. He uses it for all the crown's most sensitive investments." He looked at me, and his golden eyes were filled with a terrible, soul-shattering understanding. He taught me how to do it himself. The air went thin. The name was unspoken, but it hung between us, a toxic cloud. The man who had been his mentor. The man who had stood by his side since he was a boy. The man who had smiled at me in the hallway, his eyes like chips of ice. The man my king trusted above all others. Kale. The name was a death sentence. It recontextualized everything. Kale, orchestrating the framing of my mother to remove a powerful, loyal alpha from the board. Kale, likely poisoning the old king's mind, or perhaps even his body. Kale, clearing the way for a young, malleable Charles to take the throne, a prince he could guide and control. Kale, my tormentor, my family's destroyer, had been standing beside us, smiling, This entire time. I watched as a decade of lies settled upon Charles's shoulders. The betrayal was absolute, a poison that remade his entire world. The stillness that fell over him was the most terrifying thing I had ever seen. It was the calm at the center of a hurricane, the moment before the world is torn apart. His hand clenched on the ledger, the old parchment groaning in protest. "He will not," he whispered, his voice a low, deadly thing, the sound of a beast promising a kill. See the sun rise. Chapter 12. An Alliance of Blood. We left the archives with the truth clutched in our hands, a venomous, living thing. The castle around us was no longer a home or a prison. It was a viper's nest. Every shadow seemed to lengthen, every flicker of a torch seemed to hide a watching eye. The silence was different now. It wasn't empty, it was waiting. We were halfway down the grand staircase when I felt it, a subtle shift in the air, the scent of something metallic and wrong. Charles felt it too. He stopped, his body going rigid, one hand protectively moving in front of me. "Get back," he breathed, his golden eyes scanning the darkness below. It was too late. They flowed from the shadows like ink spilling across the marble floor. 4 figures, clad in black from head to toe, their faces hidden by masks. They moved with an unnatural silence, their blades, forged of polished silver, gleaming in the faint moonlight. Assassins. Kyle hadn't waited for a confrontation. He hadn't waited for proof. He had known, somehow, that we had found him out. He had moved to silence us forever. There was no roar of rage from Charles. Not this time. The man who exploded into motion was not the out-of-control beast from the antechamber. This was something far more terrifying. This was the Beast King, focused, lethal, and utterly in control of his own terrifying power. He was a whirlwind of controlled fury, his movements a blur of deadly precision. The first assassin lunged, and Charles simply moved inside the man's guard, a brutal snap of a forearm echoing in the hall before the body even hit the ground. I scrambled back, my heart hammering against my ribs. I was not a warrior. I was not a queen. I was a servant, out of my depth, a liability in a fight for our lives. But as a second assassin peeled off to come after me, the years of secret, silent training my mother had given me took over. I wasn't strong enough to fight him head-on, but I was fast, and I knew this castle better than anyone. As the assassin lunged, I dove sideways, grabbing a heavy tapestry from the wall and pulling. The massive cloth, weighted with silver thread, collapsed on top of him, tangling him for a precious second. It was long enough. Charles was there, a dark flash of motion, and the man's gurgle was cut short. We were back to back, 2 desperate animals fighting for their lives. "To the left!" I shouted, seeing the flicker of a third blade in the periphery. He spun, parrying the blow with his bare arm, the silver leaving a sizzling, smoking gash on his skin that healed almost as fast as it was made. He grunted in pain but didn't falter, his other hand finding the assassin's throat. The final killer saw his chance. While Charles was occupied, he launched himself directly at me, a silver dagger aimed straight for my heart. He was too fast. I had nowhere to run. Charles was too far away to stop him. This is it, I thought, a strange sense of calm washing over me. This is the ruin I was born to bring him. But then Charles moved. It wasn't human speed. It was something else entirely, a primal explosion of force. He threw the body of the man he was holding and launched himself across the space, covering 20 feet in the blink of an eye. He didn't just block the blow. He became a living shield. He slammed into the assassin, his body taking the full force of the man's momentum. They crashed into the far wall, and I heard a sickening crunch. Charles stood over the crumpled form of the last killer, his chest heaving, his arm bleeding freely from a deep gash the silver dagger had left. He stood there panting, his body placed firmly between me and the rest of the world. He was spattered with blood, his golden eyes blazing with a fierce, protective light that had nothing to do with rage and everything to do with possession. He looked at me, and in his gaze I saw the shift. I was no longer the curse that haunted him. I was no longer the weakness that would bring him ruin. I was his, to protect, to defend, to kill for. Our bond, forged in fear and pain, was now tempered in blood. It was no longer a chain. It was a weapon. He looked down at the bodies, then back at me, his eyes burning with a new, terrifying purpose. Now, he growled, the word a promise that sent a shiver down my spine. We hunt. Chapter 13, A Declaration of Wolves. The metallic scent of blood was a strange perfume for a new beginning. We stood in the silent, shadowed corridor, the bodies of Kale's assassins cooling on the marble floor around us. The adrenaline of the fight still sang in my veins, a wild, sharp music that had replaced the dull hum of fear I had lived with for a decade. I looked at Charles, his face spattered with gore, his arm wrapped in a makeshift bandage, and I did not see a king or a beast. I saw a partner. I saw an ally. The hunt had begun. He knows, I whispered, my voice steady in the quiet aftermath. He knows we have the proof. He will not wait for us to present it. No, Charles agreed, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. His gaze was fixed on the darkness, as if he could already see Kale moving through the castle's secret passages, laying his next trap. He has played a long, patient game, but a cornered snake is no longer patient. It only bites. We retreated to his chambers, the evidence of Kale's treason a heavy weight in a satchel. The dynamic between us had shifted, the air no longer thick with torment and unspoken desire, but with the sharp, clean focus of a shared purpose. He looked at me, not as his prisoner, not as his temptation, but as a fellow strategist. We cannot simply execute him, he stated, pacing before the fire. His roots run too deep. Half the royal council is loyal to him. They see him as the stable hand that guides the Beast King. To kill him without absolute public proof would be to declare myself a tyrant. It would start a civil war. So we give them the proof, I countered, my mind racing, a clarity I hadn't felt in years cutting through the fog of my fear. We don't challenge him in the shadows. We drag him into the light. We confront him in front of the entire council, present the ledgers, show them all that the man they trust is the one who has been poisoning this kingdom from the very beginning. It was a wild, desperate gamble, a throw of the dice that would either save the kingdom or shatter it completely. He stopped pacing and turned to me, his golden eyes searching my face. They will not believe us. They will see a disgraced servant girl and a king they already believe is half mad. He will twist it. He will turn it back on us. He will try, I said, taking a step closer, my voice filled with a conviction that surprised even me. But you are the king. Your word still holds power, and I hesitated, then found the strength to continue. I am the daughter of Lyra. There are still those in the court who remember my mother. They remember her loyalty. Her word was her bond. My word is all I have left of her. We stood there, the firelight dancing between us, the unspoken truth hanging in the air. This was the point of no return. To make this move was to declare war, not just on Kale, but on the entire rot within the court. He studied me for a long, silent moment. I saw the calculation in his eyes, the weighing of risks, but I also saw something else, a flicker of respect, a grudging admiration. He was finally seeing me not as the prophecy's curse, but as a wolf in my own right. "Are you ready for this, Alyssa?" he asked, his voice low, serious. He was asking if I was ready to step out of the shadows, to reclaim my name and face the hatred and fear it would bring. I thought of my mother's last look, of the 10 years I had spent as a ghost. The hiding was over. "I am," I whispered. He gave a sharp, decisive nod. "At noon, then. The council will be convened." We walked towards the council chambers hours later, side by side, not as a king and his servant, but as something new, something dangerous. We were a declaration. The guards swung the massive doors open, the sound echoing like a war horn. And there, at the center of the room, Surrounded by the lords and ladies of the court stood Kyle. He turned as we entered, a brilliant, welcoming smile spreading across his face, as if he had been expecting us all along. Chapter 14. The Traitor's Gambit. The silence in the council chamber was a living thing, heavy and suffocating. Every eye was on me as I took my place not by the wall, but a step behind the king's throne. It was a scandal, an unheard-of breach of protocol, a servant girl standing in the heart of power. It was the first move in our desperate game, and I could feel the disapproval of the court like a physical blow. Charles did not wait. His voice, cold and powerful, filled the chamber. My lords and ladies, I have called you here to reveal a cancer that has been growing in the heart of this kingdom for more than a decade. He laid out the accusation, his words sharp and precise. He presented the ledgers, the proof of the illegal land transfers, the evidence of a conspiracy that led back to one man. He pointed a single, accusing finger. Lord Kale, you stand accused of high treason, of the framing of Alpha Lyra, and of conspiring against the crown you swore to protect. A wave of shocked murmurs rippled through the council, but Kale did not look shocked. He looked amused. He laughed. It was not a loud sound, but a soft, pitying chuckle that cut through the tension and drew every eye to him. He stepped forward, his expression one of patient sadness. My king, he said, his voice smooth as polished stone. You are unwell. He turned to the council. It is true. I arranged those land transfers. I did so at the secret request of your father, the old king. He feared that in the chaos following the traitor Lyra's execution, her family's vast assets would be plundered by opportunists. I created a holding company to protect those assets for the good of the crown. He spun the truth into a masterful lie, painting himself as a loyal servant doing his sad duty. The council members nodded, their faces relaxing. This made sense. This was the Kale they knew. Then, he turned his gaze on me, and the trap sprung. I have not spoken of this, he said, his voice filled with false regret. But I can no longer stay silent. I have been investigating our king's recent erratic behavior, his violent outbursts, his strange obsession with this servant girl. He let his words hang in the air, a poisonous cloud. And I have discovered the horrifying truth. He looked directly at me. This is no servant girl. This is Alyssa, the last of the traitor's bloodline. A gasp went through the room. And she has bewitched our king, just as her mother tried to bewitch his father before her. He stepped into the center of the room, his voice rising with theatrical power. There is a prophecy, an old and terrible prophecy that speaks of her bloodline. It says that if her power is ever joined with the throne, it will bring absolute ruin. Our king's beast is out of control because he is under her spell, chained to a fate that will destroy us all. The council turned as one, their eyes full of dawning horror. They looked at Charles, at the fierce, protective way he stood before me. They remembered his violence in the antechamber. They saw Kale's lie, and they believed it. They saw a bewitched king, a cursed mate, and the ruin of their kingdom. The girl must be seized, one of the lords shouted. She must be imprisoned. No! Charles roared, his own power flaring, a golden, violent aura that pulsed around him. His instinctive, protective rage only served to prove Kale's point in their eyes. He looked unstable. He looked enchanted. He was a king, but he stood utterly alone. His entire council turned against him. We were isolated, surrounded by a sea of hostile faces. In the midst of the chaos, as the guards began to draw their swords, Kale's gaze found mine. He leaned towards me, his whisper a venomous hiss meant only for me. I told you he was not a tame creature, he breathed, a triumphant smile playing on his lips. Now everyone sees it. Now you will be the one they blame when they are forced to put him down. Chapter 15. A glimmer of silver chaos erupted. The council chamber, once a place of order, became a powder keg ignited by Cale's words. Lords shouted, ladies screamed, and the royal guard, the very men sworn to protect their king, hesitated. Their loyalty was fractured, torn between the mad-looking monarch before them and the calm, persuasive Beta, who seemed to be the only voice of reason. The room was a whirlwind of fear and confusion. "For the good of the kingdom!" Cale's voice boomed over the noise, a rallying cry for the traitors he had planted. "The girl must be restrained." It was the signal. A dozen guards, their faces set and grim, moved as one. They weren't attacking the king, not yet. They were coming for me. Charles became a whirlwind of fury, a blur of motion as he threw himself in front of me, a living shield of muscle and rage. He fought with the ferocity of a cornered lion, disarming one guard, throwing another across the room. But it wasn't like the clean, lethal fight against the assassins. This was a messy, desperate brawl. He was outnumbered, surrounded, trying to fight his own men without killing them. I was no longer a strategist. I was the prize, the weakness, the target. A guard broke through Charles's defense, his face a mask of grim duty. He grabbed me from behind, his arm a band of steel around my throat. I felt something cold and heavy press against the skin of my wrist. A silver chain, a wolf's bane, designed to nullify a shifter's power, to poison them from the inside out. The touch of the cold metal was a spark on dry tinder. A decade of suppression, a lifetime of fear, the endless whispers of being a traitor's child, the agony of the rejection, the pain of hiding. It all coalesced into a single explosive point of pure, unadulterated rage. I was done being a victim. I was done being a pawn in their games. I was done being the ghost in my own life. I let go. It wasn't a decision. It was a detonation. A raw, untamed power surged through me, shattering the chains of herbs and whispered prayers I had wrapped around my own soul. I threw my head back and a sound ripped from my throat, a sound that was not entirely human. It was a guttural snarl, filled with all the pain and fury I had swallowed for 10 long years. My eyes, once a dull servant's brown, blazed with an inner silver light. The guard holding me cried out as my fingernails elongated into wicked, curved claws, and I raked them across his arm, tearing through his leather bracer and the flesh beneath. He recoiled in shock and pain, his grip loosening just enough. I spun, my body moving with a speed and grace I didn't know I possessed, and threw him away from me. He crashed into 2 other guards, a tangle of stunned men. The entire room fell into a shocked, horrified silence. They stared at me, no longer seeing a servant girl, no longer seeing a political pawn. They saw what I really was, a monster, a wolf. Across the room, through the chaos, Cale's gaze met mine. The shock on his face was fleeting, quickly replaced by a look of greedy, chilling triumph. This was what he wanted. He had not just wanted to isolate me or discredit me. He had wanted to expose me, to force my power out into the open for all to see. As Charles fought his way to my side, his face a mask of fierce, desperate protection, the question burned itself into my mind, more terrifying than any drawn sword. Why? This was never just about the throne. This was about me. And I had just walked, claws first, directly into the real trap. Chapter 16. The Kingdom of Lies. For a single wild moment, there was power. The stunned silence of the court, the raw fear in the eyes of my enemies, the silver blaze of my own untamed wolf. It was a taste of freedom so potent it was intoxicating. I was no longer the servant, the ghost, the victim. I was a weapon, but a weapon I did not know how to wield. Kyle recovered first. His shock melted into a look of chilling, righteous fury. He seized the narrative, his voice booming through the chamber, painting me as the monster I suddenly looked to be. See, the beast reveals itself. It has been wearing a human mask to poison our king's mind. Seize the creature before it kills us all. The court erupted. The guards who had hesitated before now saw a clear threat. They saw a snarling, silver-eyed shifter, not the terrified girl beneath. Charles roared, a sound of pure defiance, and threw himself in front of me, a shield of royal fury. He was magnificent, a king fighting his own army for the life of his fated mate. But he was just one man, one wolf. And they were a tide of steel and fear. They were a trap. As Charles fought, bogged down in a desperate battle against men who were trying to subdue him for his own good, a new threat emerged. They came not from the main doors, but from the tapestries, from the shadowed alcoves. Cale's personal guard. Their eyes were cold, their movements brutally efficient, and they ignored the king completely. Their only target was me. I fought back, my claws and newfound strength a wild, desperate storm. But it was the fury of a cornered animal, not a trained warrior. They didn't try to fight me, they herded me, they used nets, weighted with heavy silver links that hissed and burned where they touched my skin, sapping my strength, dragging me down. I tore through one, then another, but there were too many. I saw Charles's desperate, furious face across the room. He was trying to get to me, roaring my name, but his own guards, his own loyal men, were clinging to him, convinced they were saving him from my enchantment. We were separated by a sea of lies. Then, a sharp sting in my neck. I looked down and saw the feathered shaft of a dart. My legs turned to water. The silver fire in my veins sputtered and died, smothered by a potent magical sedative. My claws receded. My vision blurred, the chaos of the room smearing into streaks of color and light. The last thing I saw before the darkness consumed me was Charles. He finally threw off the guards holding him, his face a mask of pure, feral agony. He saw me fall. He saw Cale's men swarm over me, wrapping me in silver chains. He opened his mouth and roared my name one last time, a sound of such utter desolation and helpless fury that it would haunt my nightmares forever. He had been captured. The king had fallen. I woke to the jarring rattle of carriage wheels on a rough, unpaved road. Darkness. The cloying smell of damp earth and something else. Something foul, like old blood and dark magic. My body was heavy, my limbs unresponsive. I was bound, hand and foot, in silver chains that felt like they were drinking the very life from my soul. My wolf was a faint, whimpering thing in the back of my mind, too weak to even stir. The trap had sprung, and I had been taken. Chapter 17. A Prophecy of Ash. The journey ended with me being dragged from the carriage and thrown into a cell. It wasn't a royal prison. It was a dungeon, ancient and cruel. The air was cold enough to see my breath, and it reeked of mildew and forgotten despair. The silver chains were gone, but the cell door was solid iron with no window, no light. There was only the dripping sound of water and the oppressive, suffocating darkness. I was alone with the echoes of Charles's last, agonized roar. Hours or maybe days later, the door creaked open. Light flooded the cell, momentarily blinding me. Lord Cale stood there, a torch in his hand, his face a mask of calm, academic curiosity. He looked less like a usurper and more like a scholar observing a rare specimen. "Remarkable," he said, his voice soft. "The resilience of your bloodline is even greater than the old texts suggested." "Where is he?" I demanded, my voice a raw croak. "Where is Charles?" A pitying smile touched his lips. "The king?" he mused. "By now, I imagine he is little more than the beast everyone always feared he would become. Lost in his own rage, without you to anchor him. He is rampaging through his own kingdom, hunting for you, destroying the last vestiges of loyalty his people had. I have, of course, sent my own men to contain him, for the good of the kingdom. He was destroying Charles, isolating him, breaking him, turning him into the monster everyone could justify putting down. You won't get away with this, I spat, pushing myself up against the cold wall. My dear Alyssa, I already have, he said patiently. He entered the cell, his movements unhurried, unafraid. You think this was about a throne? That's so small, so unimaginative. This was never about a crown. It has always been about power, real power, the power of the prophecy, the power flowing through your veins. He knelt before me, his eyes gleaming with a fanatic's light. I have studied the old ways, the dark magic the modern werewolf has forgotten. The prophecy is not just about ruin or salvation. It is about the release of a catastrophic amount of raw, divine energy, and that energy can be harnessed. The full, horrifying truth of his plan began to dawn on me. "I am not going to kill you," he continued, as if reading my mind. "I am going to elevate you. I am going to perform a ritual that will sever your pathetic, sentimental bond to Charles, and then forcibly rebond you to a new alpha, an alpha of my choosing." My blood ran cold. A forced bond. It was the ultimate violation, a fate worse than any death. "The prophecy says a forced bond brings ruin," Cale explained, his voice filled with manic excitement. "And it will. The ruin will be directed at Charles, at his bloodline, annihilating it forever, and the power unleashed in that moment of cataclysm. I will be there to catch it, to contain it. I will become something more than a king, more than an alpha. I will become a god." I felt the bond, the thin, frayed thread that still connected me to Charles across the distance. It was a conduit of pure agony. I could feel his frantic, desperate rage, his pain, his confusion. Cale's plan was not just to kill him, but to make me the weapon that did it, to make our own fated love the instrument of his destruction. Cale stood up, dusting off his knees. "Rest, Alyssa. The ritual begins on the next dark moon. You will want to have your strength." He left me in the crushing darkness, the echo of his words a poison seeping into my soul. There was no escape. There was no one coming to save me. I was a sacrifice, waiting on an altar of his ambition. Chapter 18. The Darkest Moon. The sound of chanting dragged me from a fitful, nightmare-filled sleep. It was a low, guttural drone that seemed to come from the very stones of the fortress, a vibration of dark intent that made my teeth ache. The iron door to my cell scraped open, and two of Cale's guards, their faces grim and their eyes empty, hauled me to my feet. They dragged me through winding corridors, the chanting growing louder, closer. They threw me into the ritual chamber. It was a circular room, ancient and vast. The floor was covered in a complex array of symbols I didn't recognize, painted in something dark that smelled coppery and wet. Blood. The air was thick and cloying, heavy with the smell of ozone and burning herbs I couldn't name. It felt like walking into a place that God and the goddess had long abandoned. Kyle stood in the center of the symbols, dressed in dark ceremonial robes, looking every bit the high priest of some forgotten evil faith. And beside him stood the Alpha. He was a brute, a massive, scarred wolf from a rival pack I recognized from court gossip. A cruel, ambitious male named Fenris. His eyes glowed with a greedy, triumphant light as he looked at me. He was to be my new master, my cage. "Bring her forward," Cale commanded. I fought. I kicked and snarled, but my body was weak, starved and drained by the damp, oppressive magic of this place. They dragged me to the center of the circle and forced me to my knees before Fenris. "The bond between fated mates is a sacred, living thing," Cale intoned, his voice echoing unnaturally in the chamber. "But like any living thing, it can be murdered." He began the incantation. The words were a language of nightmare, harsh and guttural. As he spoke, the bloody symbols on the floor began to glow with a sickly red light. The magic was not just a sound. It was a physical force. It felt like cold, oily tendrils of smoke wrapping around my soul, probing, searching for the delicate thread that connected me to Charles. I screamed in my mind, fighting back. Charles! I clung to that connection with every ounce of my will. I could feel him, a distant storm of rage and pain, a desperate, howling beacon in the dark. But the dark magic was too strong. The tendrils found the bond and began to pull. It felt like they were trying to rip my very soul out of my body. The connection to Charles, my only anchor in this nightmare, began to fray, to thin, to stretch to the breaking point. The feeling of his presence started to dim, overwhelmed by the suffocating power of Cale's ritual. A profound, terrifying emptiness began to seep into me. My will was fading. I was losing him. "Now," Cale commanded. "The severing is almost complete. Alpha Fenris, prepare to make your claim." Fenris stepped forward, his lips curling back in a predatory snarl, revealing long, yellowed fangs. He lowered his head, his hot breath on my neck, preparing to deliver the bite that would shatter my soul and seal the kingdom's doom. This was it, the ruin, the end of everything. My mother's sacrifice had been for nothing. I had failed. Hope was a dead, cold thing in my chest. As Cale's voice rose to a fever pitch, reaching the final words of his dark spell, a sound, faint, distant, but real. It was not the wind. It was not the storm. It was a sound of pure, world-breaking rage. A sound that ripped through the stone, through the magic, through the despair, and found me in the dark. A howl. His howl. Chapter 19. The Howl and the Spark. The howl was not a sound. It was a physical thing, a shockwave of pure, undiluted rage and desperate, agonizing love that ripped through the fortress walls, through the dark magic, through the very fabric of my despair. It was a lifeline thrown across a chasm of hopelessness. It struck the frayed, dying thread of our mate bond, and the connection, which Cale's ritual had almost severed, flared to life like a forge being stoked with a blast of winter air. Charles. The chanting faltered. Cale's head snapped up, his concentration broken for a single, crucial second. Fenris, the brutish alpha who was about to sink his fangs into my neck, flinched, his own wolf instincts recognizing the challenge of a true king. In that heartbeat of distraction, the oily tendrils of the dark magic loosened their grip on my soul. The howl had given me an anchor, a focal point in the storm of my own defeat. I clung to it, to the raw, beautiful agony in that sound. He was here. He was fighting. He was not broken. A series of images flashed behind my eyes, fast as a panicked heartbeat. My mother's face, calm and fierce, whispering, "Never let them make you forget what you are." The 10 years of silent, suffocating endurance, a feat of willpower that had honed my spirit to a razor's edge. Charles, his eyes full of a pain that mirrored my own, whispering, "We are trapped." Trapped. Yes. But a wolf does not wait for the hunter to open the cage door. It chews through its own leg to get free. It breaks the trap with its own teeth. A new fire ignited in the ashes of my soul. It was not hope. It was something harder, colder, and far more dangerous. It was rage, a pure, cold fury at Cale for his ambition, at the world for its cruelty, and at myself for so willingly wearing the chains of a victim. Hiding had been a choice. Enduring had been a choice. Surviving had been a choice. Now, I was making a new one. I was choosing to fight. I was not a pawn of prophecy. I was not a vessel of power for some man to wield. I was the daughter of Lyra. I was the last of the Silver Moon bloodline, and my destiny was my own to forge. I would not be the ruin. I would be the reckoning. I stopped fighting the dark magic that was trying to consume me. Instead, I opened my soul to it. I let the sickly red energy pour into me, and I met it not with fear, but with the pure, untamed silver fire of my own wolf spirit. The two forces collided inside me, a war of darkness and light, and my inner wolf for the first time in its life began to feast. I opened my eyes. The terror was gone, burned away. All that remained was a calm, lethal certainty. Kyle saw it. I watched his confident smirk dissolve into a flicker of genuine shock, then dawning horror. Fenris, the brutish alpha, who had been ready to claim me, took an instinctive, stumbling step backward, a low whine of fear in his throat. They were no longer looking at a sacrifice. They were looking at a predator who had just been awakened from a 10-year sleep, and she was starving. Chapter 20. Born of Silver Fire. "Finish it!" Kale screamed, his voice cracking, his priestly composure shattered. "Fenris, claim her now!" But Fenris was frozen, his ambition completely overridden by the primal animal instinct that was screaming at him to flee. The thing kneeling in the center of the circle was no longer a helpless female. Her silver eyes were ancient and terrible, blazing with a light that promised death. I rose to my feet, my movements slow, fluid, deliberate. I looked down at the silver chains still binding my wrists, the metal that had poisoned me, weakened me, kept me small. I focused on them, not with anger, but with pure intent. I did not need to break them. I simply needed to command them to let go. A wave of silver light erupted from my body. It wasn't a transformation of snapping bone and tearing flesh. It was an unwinding, an unveiling. The light poured from me, a silent, beautiful explosion. The blood-red symbols on the floor hissed and vanished, incinerated by my pure, untainted power. The silver chains on my wrists glowed white-hot for a moment, then melted away into nothingness. My plain servant's dress dissolved into motes of light, and my body began to shift, to lengthen, to reform. I was not becoming a monster. I was becoming myself. When the light faded, I stood before them in my true form, a wolf. But I was not the feral, desperate creature of my fears. I was larger than any wolf I had ever seen, my fur the color of liquid moonlight, my body a lithe, powerful instrument of grace and lethality. I was the wolf my mother had described in stories, a true Luna, born of magic as much as of blood. The guards in the room, Kale's loyal men, finally broke from their shock, raising their silver-tipped spears. They were a joke. I moved, a silver blur they couldn't even track. I didn't kill them. I disarmed them. I broke them, using the silent combat forms my mother had taught me, now amplified with a speed and strength that was divine. I turned my attention to Fenris. He was trembling, his form flickering as his own terrified wolf tried to take over. I didn't attack him. I simply walked towards him, my head held high, and let the full weight of my alpha presence, a power I didn't know I had until this very moment, crash down upon him. He collapsed onto his belly, his head lowered, exposing his throat in the ultimate gesture of submission. I had not needed to fight him. I had simply reminded him of his place. Finally, there was only Kyle. He stood amidst the wreckage of his grand plan, his face a mask of disbelief and terror. He summoned his dark magic, a swirling ball of sickly green energy, and hurled it at me. I did not dodge. I simply tilted my head, and my silver aura flared, absorbing the dark energy, drinking it like water. It had no effect on me. My light consumed his darkness. He scrambled backward, falling over one of his own unconscious guards. I stalked towards him, my paws silent on the stone. I could have torn his throat out, I could have ended it. But my goal was not revenge. Not yet. My goal was Charles. With a final, contemptuous glance at the groveling traitor, I turned and burst from the ritual chamber, a radiant silver wolf on a singular, desperate mission. I had to get to him. Chapter 21. A Storm on the Walls. The fortress was a hive of chaos. Alarms, loud and frantic, blared through the stone corridors. Men were shouting, running, their fear a delicious, intoxicating scent in the air. I was a silver blur, a phantom of moonlight and fury, moving through the halls with a purpose that was as sharp and clear as a shard of glass. My senses were on fire. The world was a symphony of information I had been deaf to my entire life. I could smell the fear sweat of the guards, the distant coppery tang of blood from the battle outside, the path of the clean, cold air that led to freedom. I could hear the frantic heartbeats of the men hiding in the alcoves, the scrape of a boot 100 yards away, and above it all I could hear him. Charles. He was a storm battering against the fortress walls, a relentless roaring tempest of grief and rage. Every crash of his body against the outer defenses, every splintering of wood and cracking of stone, was a beat of his heart that I could feel in my own. He was close. But he was still outside, and this fortress was built to withstand an army. I raced through the corridors, a silent, lethal predator. Kale's guards tried to stop me. They were brave, I'll give them that. But they were men fighting a force of nature. I moved through them, a whirlwind of silver fur and flashing claws. I was not a mindless beast. I was a warrior. I used the environment, collapsing a weak archway to block pursuers, using the deep shadows to ambush a patrol. My mother's lessons and my wolf's instincts had merged into a seamless, deadly dance. I finally reached the Great Hall, the last bastion before the main gate. It was swarming with Kale's elite guard, a wall of steel and silver-tipped spears. They had formed a phalanx, a defensive posture meant to hold against a siege. Outside, the sounds of the battle reached a crescendo. A massive, splintering crash echoed through the fortress, followed by a roar of pure, unrestrained alpha power that shook the very foundations of the building. Charles had broken through the outer defenses. He was at the main gate. I did not hesitate. I launched myself at the shield wall. The guards braced, expecting a frontal assault. But I was not just strength. I was speed. I ran straight at them, then used the wall itself as a springboard, leaping over their heads, my claws finding purchase in the ancient tapestries above. I landed behind their lines, sowing chaos and confusion. While they were scrambling to turn, I ignored them and sprinted for the gate. It was a monstrous thing of iron and oak, held shut by a massive iron bar that took 4 men to lift. Outside, I could hear Charles, a frantic, furious battering against the other side. He was trying to smash his way through. My own heart ached with the force of his desperation. "I am here," I screamed in my soul, a call across the bond. "Charles, I am here." I lowered my shoulder and slammed my full weight against the iron bar. It groaned in protest. I hit it again, the muscles in my wolf form coiling with a power I was only just beginning to understand. The bar bent. With a final, explosive surge of strength, I snapped the iron in two. With a roar of my own, I threw my body against the massive wooden doors. They groaned, splintered, and then burst outward, just as Charles, in his own magnificent, terrifying wolf form, a beast of midnight fur and blazing golden eyes, smashed through the last of the barricades from the other side. For a single, silent moment, the battle ceased. In the blood-soaked courtyard, under the pale, watchful eye of the moon, the 2 fated wolves finally stood together, one of silver, one of night. The storm of our reunion had arrived, and the final battle was about to begin. Chapter 22. A Song of Silver and Night. The world held its breath. In the center of the bloody courtyard, under the pale eye of the moon, we stood. A wolf of silver fire and a wolf of midnight shadow. Time seemed to stop, the chaos of the battle fading into a dull roar at the edge of my senses. I looked into his blazing golden eyes, and he looked into my silver ones. An entire conversation passed between us in that single silent moment. A decade of pain, a lifetime of longing, and a sacred, unspoken vow. We were one soul in 2 bodies, and it was time to fight like it. We did not need a plan. We did not need words. We moved. It was a dance of beautiful, terrible violence. Charles was the storm, a relentless force of nature, his massive black form a battering ram of muscle and fury. He was the unbreakable shield, the anchor of our assault, taking the brunt of the attack, his powerful jaws snapping through steel and bone with equal ease. Kale's men, who had been prepared to fight a single, frenzied beast, were completely unprepared for the reality of a true Alpha King, fighting with absolute clarity and purpose. And I was the lightning that danced in his storm. I was speed. I was grace. I was a silver dagger that slipped through the cracks in their defenses. Where Charles was the roar, I was the whisper of death that came from behind. I moved through the battle like a phantom, my mother's combat lessons a deadly song in my blood, my wolf's instincts guiding my every move. I disabled, I disarmed, I herded our enemies into the path of his unstoppable fury. We were a perfect, seamless unit of destruction. We covered each other's flanks without looking, anticipated each other's moves without thought. The bond between us was no longer a chain or a source of pain. It was a conduit, a river of shared strength and instinct that flowed between us, making us something more than just two wolves. We were a single entity, a legend brought to life. The remaining guards, seeing their ranks decimated, their courage shattered, began to break and flee. Soon, there was only one left standing amidst the carnage: Kyle. He stood near the broken fountain, his fine robe splattered with blood that was not his own, his face a mask of pale, sweating disbelief. He was no warrior. His weapons were lies and manipulation, and they were useless here. In his hand, he held a single, wicked-looking dagger, its blade coated in a thick, black paste that seemed to drink the moonlight. Concentrated silver nitrate, a poison with no cure. "This was not how it was supposed to be," he shrieked, his voice thin and shrill with panic. "The prophecy spoke of ruin, not this." The prophecy did not account for her. Charles's voice growled in my mind, a thought that was his but felt like my own. Cale lunged not at Charles, the bigger threat, but at me. The cornered snake, making one last venomous strike at the heart of his problem. He was fast, fueled by desperation. I braced myself, ready to meet him. But Charles was faster. He moved not with the thought of a king, but with the selfless, absolute instinct of a mate. He threw himself in front of me, a shield of black fur and boundless love. He didn't try to stop the blade. He simply took it. The dagger slid deep into his side, a fatal, final blow. He gave a sharp, surprised grunt, his massive form shuddering. The strength seemed to drain from him all at once. Cale scrambled back, a triumphant, mad grin spreading across his face. Charles collapsed, his great wolf form flickering, the rich black of his fur turning a dull, lifeless gray around the edges of the wound. He was shifting back, his body too weak to hold the wolf. He whimpered, a low, pathetic sound that shattered my heart into a million pieces. Across our bond, his presence, once a roaring fire, was now a fading ember. He was calling my name over and over, a weak, dying whisper in my soul. Cale stood over us, laughing, the bloody dagger held high. "Ruin," he hissed, his eyes blazing with victory. "I told you, you are nothing but ruin." Chapter 23. The Mark and the Flame. Time ceased to exist. The world dissolved into a narrow, gray tunnel focused on the dying wolf at my feet. Charles's life force was pouring out of him, a torrent of pain and fading light that I felt in every fiber of my being. Our bond was screaming, a high, thin note of absolute agony, the sound of a soul being torn from its other half. His golden eyes, flickering between wolf and man, found mine, and in them I saw a terrible, final acceptance. He was dying, and Cale, the architect of all our pain, was standing over us, savoring his victory. But the prophecy, the words echoed in my mind, a desperate, frantic mantra. If her bloodline mates willingly, it will strengthen the kingdom. A willing bond, a completed bond. The marking. It was the male's right, the ultimate act of claiming a mate, a right Charles would now never have. But the prophecy didn't say who had to do the marking. It only said willingly. A wild, desperate, brilliant idea ignited in my soul. A choice. My choice. The ultimate act of defiance against a fate that had been written for me. I would not be his ruin. I would be his salvation. I would not be claimed. I would claim him. I leaned down, my silver wolf form pressing against his fading one. I looked into his eyes, and through our bond, I sent a single, powerful wave of emotion, not fear, not despair, but pure, undiluted love and absolute resolve. Mine. Then, I lowered my head and sank my fangs into the flesh of his shoulder. It was not an act of violence. It was an act of creation. The moment my mark was made, A supernova of pure, white, divine light erupted from our joined bodies. It was not the heat of a fire, but the warmth of 1,000 suns, a power so immense and pure it had no sound. It was the feeling of a soul being made whole. It was the prophecy, fulfilling itself not through a king's claim, but through a queen's selfless, revolutionary choice. The light washed over Kale. He had just enough time for his triumphant smile to turn into a look of horrified disbelief before he was consumed. He did not scream. He simply dissolved. The light touched him, and his dark, twisted soul was unmade, leaving nothing behind but a faint dusting of ash that the wind caught and scattered into the night. The light poured into Charles. I felt the poison in his veins burn away to nothing. I felt the wound in his side seal, leaving no scar. His fur, which had been a dull, lifeless gray, returned to its rich, midnight black. His life force, once a fading ember, roared back into a blazing inferno. It washed over me, a wave of warmth and power that settled deep in my bones, completing the transformation I had started in the dungeon. My silver fur seemed to now hold the light of the moon itself, a soft, ethereal glow. The light faded. The battle was over. The silence that fell over the courtyard was absolute. And then our 2 wolves, one of silver and one of night, lifted our heads to the sky. We howled as one. It was not a sound of rage or of grief. It was a single, perfect, harmonious note of creation, of love, of absolute power, a song of a new world being born. As the last echo of our howl faded, every wolf left standing in the courtyard, Kale's broken men, the few royal guards who had followed their king, even the brutish Alpha Fenris who had emerged from the fortress to witness the end, dropped to their knees. They lowered their heads, their throats exposed, in the ultimate gesture of submission. They were not bowing to a king and his consort. They were bowing to a god and goddess, the living, breathing embodiment of the moon's will made manifest. Chapter 24. A Reign of Dawn. 3 weeks later, the Great Hall was unrecognizable. The dark, imposing tapestries of war and conquest had been replaced with new ones, woven in threads of silver and black, depicting a silver wolf and a night wolf running side by side under a full moon. The room was filled not with the stifling air of fear, but with the bright, clean light of a new morning pouring through the tall, arched windows. The entire court was assembled, their faces a mixture of awe, reverence, and a touch of healthy fear. The heavy doors swung open. Charles entered, and the court bowed as one. He was still their king, a figure of immense power and authority. But something was different. The restless, beastly energy was gone, replaced by a calm, confident strength. He was whole. He was not alone. I walked at his side. I was not wearing a servant's gray dress. I wore a simple, elegant gown of deep silver, the color of my wolf, the color of my house. My hair, which I had kept tightly bound for a decade, flowed freely down my back. I wore no crown, no jewels. I did not need them. My power, my authority, was a living thing, a soft, silver aura that everyone in the room could feel. I was no longer hiding. I was no longer afraid. I was home. We took our places on the dais, where a second throne, carved of pale weirwood and inlaid with silver, now sat beside his. As we looked out over the sea of faces, I saw how they watched me. The lords and ladies who had once seen me as nothing more than dust on the floor now looked at me with a reverence that bordered on worship. Charles looked at me, too. The raw, possessive need I had once seen in his eyes was still there, a constant, comforting fire. But it was now tempered with something deeper: awe, gratitude. A love so profound it was a tangible presence between us. He was my king, but he was also my subject, forever bound to the Luna who had remade him. He stood to address the court, his voice ringing with a new, clear authority. He spoke of Kale's treason, of the rot that had been purged from the kingdom. He spoke of a new era of justice and strength. When he was finished, he turned to me, a silent invitation. I stepped forward. The servant girl, who had been too afraid to meet anyone's gaze, now stood before the entire world, and her voice did not tremble. For a decade, this kingdom has been ruled by fear, I said, my voice clear and strong, carrying to every corner of the hall. Fear of the beast within, and fear of the enemy without. That era is over. I looked out at them all, my silver eyes meeting theirs. We will not be a kingdom of secrets and shadows. We will be a kingdom of the pack. We will be a family, bound by loyalty, protected by strength, and led not by one, but by two. We will be a kingdom of a new dawn. When I finished speaking, a deep, reverent silence filled the hall. Then, as one, the entire court, lords, ladies, guards, and servants, knelt. Charles took my hand, his touch warm and solid, an anchor in this new, incredible reality. He leaned in, his voice a low, intimate whisper meant only for me, his breath warm against my ear. My queen. I turned to him, my heart full to bursting. I looked into the endless gold of his eyes, a reflection of my own silver gaze, and I saw our future. It would not be easy, it would not be without its challenges, but it would be ours, together. A reign not of beasts and shadows, but of dawn. And it was just beginning.